The fog had teeth that morning, soft, white, and hungry. It curled between the cobblestones of Grievehaven's crooked streets and licked at the lanterns until their light became nothing more than trembling ghosts. Inside Cendre Café, the air smelled of roasted chicory and old books, of damp coats and ink-stained coins. The windows were so stained with years of rain that they had long forgotten what true daylight looked like. Eloise Thorne moved through the narrow aisles like a thought half-remembered, quick, silent, carrying a chipped porcelain cup in each hand. Her apron was mended more times than she could count, and the thread at her collarbone had started to fray again. But her posture was steady, her voice gentle when she spoke, switching easily between languages as though her tongue remembered things her mind did not. "Merci, madame," she murmured to the old merchant who paid in silver flakes. "Dank," to the foreign scholar with trembling hands. "Thank you," to the soldier who could barely lift his spoon. The café was the last refuge for those who worked too late or hoped too hard. Its owner, a bald man named Calvet, trusted Eloise more than anyone, though he didn't understand her. No one did. She'd come to Grievehaven 5 winters ago with no family name on her papers and no past to speak of. Only a knack for language, and the faintest hum in her blood when someone spoke words older than prayer. The mirror behind the counter caught her reflection as she bent to pour another cup. For a moment, she saw herself move, then, just a fraction later, her reflection followed, lagging by the space of a single heartbeat. She blinked. The mirror blinked back. She tore her gaze away, heart stuttering. It always happened when the church bells rang or the moon rose pale behind the fog. Calvet had once told her the mirror was warped, that she should ignore it. But sometimes, when she was alone, the girl in the glass would whisper in French, words Eloise didn't remember learning, words that made her bones ache. Outside, the clock tower struck 6. The shadows grew longer, reaching beneath the door like fingers. A hush fell over the café, the kind that came before the night patrols. Grievehaven after dusk belonged to the Nightwardens, pale enforcers of the Vampire King. And while most mortals feared them, Eloise only feared what might be staring back through the glass each time she looked away. She lit the last of the candles, and the flames sputtered weakly in protest against the rising mist. Customers shuffled out one by one until only a scholar remained, asleep over his ink-stained parchment. Eloise moved to wake him when the door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. The storm outside pushed through first, a whisper of cold air carrying rain and the faintest scent of iron. Then came the man. He entered as though he owned the silence. Cloaked in black, shoulders broad, a face carved with patience and danger. His hair was the color of dark wine. His eyes, impossible to name, seemed to hold both the storm and its calm. The lamplight didn't dare touch him. It only bent around him, dimming in his presence. Eloise straightened, her hand still on the scholar's shoulder. "We're closing soon," she said softly. The man smiled, a slow, cruel thing. "Then I suppose I'll have to make it worth your while." His voice was smooth, polished, and old, not by years, but by centuries. He sat at the counter as though it were a throne and removed his gloves with unhurried grace. His skin was pale as frost, his ring engraved with a sigil Eloise half recognized from forbidden prayer books. "Coffee," he said, tapping the counter with one finger. "In French." She hesitated. "Pardon?" He leaned forward. "Serve me in French," he repeated, his tone laced with amusement. "And I'll give you $10,000. The words hung in the air like a curse. Even Calvet, counting coins in the back, froze. $10,000, more than she'd earn in a lifetime. Eloise swallowed, studying the stranger's expression. He wasn't joking. His eyes glittered like mirrors catching fire. She could have refused, should have. But something inside her, the pulse that sometimes beat faster when the fog whispered, rose like a tide. "Très bien, monsieur," she said, voice clear, flawless. "So haites vous votre café noir, ou adouce avec du lait?" For a second, the world stopped breathing. The man's expression faltered, his smile dying in the space between one blink and the next. His pupils thinned to slits, then widened again. The candle beside him flickered violently, its flame bending toward her voice as though drawn to its sound. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her as one might study a ghost, disbelief, curiosity, hunger. "Your accent," he murmured. "That dialect hasn't been spoken in 2 centuries." Eloise frowned, suddenly aware that the cafe was empty. Even Calvet had disappeared to the cellar. "It's just French," she said. "Nothing strange about it." The man chuckled low, though his amusement didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, you have no idea how strange it is, little one." He reached into his coat and pulled out a coin, black metal, carved with intricate sigils that shimmered faintly like embers. He set it on the counter between them. "Payment," he said simply. "For the service and the answer you didn't mean to give." Before she could reply, thunder cracked above the city, shaking the windows. The stranger stood, adjusting his gloves. "You should lock your doors tonight, mademoiselle. The wind carries voices that like to borrow faces." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with the finality of a tomb. Eloise stared at the coin. It wasn't warm, but her fingers tingled just from touching it. The metal shimmered, faintly pulsing like a heartbeat. The sigil, a crown above a serpent, stirred something buried deep in her memory. She slipped it into her apron, breath shallow. By midnight, the rain had turned to sleet. She trudged home through the narrow streets, the gas lamps flickering as if afraid. The air hummed with unseen movement, the flit of wings, the whisper of something ancient keeping pace with her footsteps. In her small attic room, she hung her apron by the fire and tried to sleep. But the coin had other ideas. It began as warmth, a slow burn against the fabric. Then it grew hotter, until the thread caught flame. She gasped, pulling the apron from the hook. The coin fell to the floor, searing through the wooden boards. And then from the smoke came a voice. "Eloise Thorne," it whispered, deep and echoing. "By decree of His Majesty Valerian Mortaine, you are summoned to the Black Spire." She stumbled back. The voice didn't come from the air but from inside her chest, vibrating through her ribs. The room darkened. Her candle extinguished itself. From the corner, 2 figures stepped out of the shadow, tall, armored in black, faces hidden by veils of chain. The Nightwardens. One spoke, his tone devoid of mercy. "The king awaits." I can't," she stammered. "There must be some mistake." The second warden raised a gloved hand. The world tilted. Her vision blurred, colors bleeding into shadow. As lightning flared across the sky, Eloise saw the outline of the Black Spire rising from the city's heart, a tower so tall it cut the storm in 2. By the time the thunder rolled again, she was at its gates, the iron doors yawning open to swallow her whole. She took one trembling step forward. And as she crossed the threshold, she saw her shadow split cleanly in 2, one stepping ahead, the other lingering behind, whispering something she couldn't yet understand. The carriage from the Black Spire moved like a shadow across the city, wheels whispering over slick cobbles, as if the night itself conspired to swallow every scrape of sound. Inside, Eloise sat on a narrow bench, the coin still warm in her palm, the memory of the Nightwarden's veiled faces pressed behind her eyelids. The carriage's interior smelled of lavender and rust, a fragrance so carefully arranged it might have been a lie. Outside, Grievehaven dissolved into a wash of rain and the occasional flare of distant torchlight. Inside, the world narrowed to the ticking of her heart and the slow, inevitable pull of something vast and old. When the carriage halted, the Black Spire rose before her like a blade pinned into the sky. It was not merely a building but a truth. Black marble that drank light, flying buttresses like ribs, windows like blank, unblinking eyes. Lightning had fretted the clouds into a restless applause, and when thunder answered it, the sound rolled down the stone as if the tower itself hummed with memory. Lantern-bearers in deep cloaks parted the way for them, and the heavy iron gates swung inward with a sound that made Eloise's throat tighten. Servants with faces like polished porcelain stood at attention, their eyes too still, their smiles fixed. They moved with the seamless precision of those who had long ago unlearned surprise. Inside, the hall opened into a cathedral of shadow. Vaulted ceilings that swallowed the light, tapestries woven with scenes of nights no one dared name, staircases that curled like the inside of a shell. Chandeliers hung low, dripping with ruby droplets that swayed, but did not fall. They burned not with ordinary flame, but with the slow crimson of blood glass, casting everything in a warm, accusing glow. The air tasted faintly of iron, and the sweet-sour scent of wine gone old. Eloise felt as if she had stepped into a painting painted in a language she almost understood, and yet could not quite read. As they passed through corridors lined with statues whose eyes seemed to follow her, she noticed the briefings whispered between the servants. Names, dates, loyalties like coins passed under a table. The castle did not so much possess silence as cultivate it. Every sound was chosen, catalogued, permitted if and when it served a design. And beneath that cultivated quiet, she perceived another rhythm, a pulse that matched the beat of her own chest, an almost living thrum that tugged at her ears and made the hairs along her arms stand up. It called her by name, not with words but with the familiar, small tug of recognition. Eloise, carried like a secret. At the foot of a broad staircase, Valerian awaited them. He had shed the casual anonymity of the café and assumed the austere elegance of sovereigns. Moonlight clung to the shoulders of his coat, and the faintest hint of frost rimed his lashes. Up close, his features were carved with the sort of patience only centuries could teach. High cheekbones, the brittle perfection of a sculpture slightly cracked by age, a mouth that had learned to keep promises and break them with equal art. When he saw her, something in his face unclenched, and yet his eyes, those impossible eyes, tightened with an emotion she could not name. Relief, interest, the shadow of a self he seldom showed. "Eloise Thorne," he said, his voice measured, unused to clamor. "Welcome to my home." The castle answered to his name as if relieved. Tapestries shivered though there was no draft. A distant door closed with a sound like a sigh. Eloise bowed automatically, because bowing had been salved into her since childhood, but when she rose, she met him without flinching. He was as unnervingly human as he was unapproachable. "You were summoned by a coin," Valerian said, indifferent to preamble. "It did not ring in the ears of ordinary things, it rang for you." Eloise kept her hands clenched at her sides. She felt the coin growing warmer inside her apron, alive with a hunger that matched the pulse of the marble beneath her feet. "You summoned me," she said slowly, testing each syllable. "Why me? I am a waitress." You are whatever the world needs," Valerian interrupted softly. "That has been true before you were born, I think." He stepped closer, so close she could see caught between the whites of his teeth a small, almost imperceptible stain of red. "Listen to me, and do not be afraid of the truth. Your voice carries a resonance I have not heard since the reign of Clara d'Argent." His name fell into her like a stone into deep water, stirring eddies she had not known existed. Clara d'Argent, the queen whose story hung in every hushed tavern, whose portrait had been burned and rebuilt so many times no one remembered which was original. The woman who, according to the less pleasant songs, had sworn a curse with her death that left his kind perpetually hungry and made the night their domain. "You mean the old legends?" Eloise asked, tasting the name like iron on her tongue. Valerian's expression shifted, and for the first time she saw grief. It was not theatrical. It lived in the small fissures around his mouth, the slackening of his jaw. "Legends are honest things dressed in the poor clothes of memory," he offered. "Clara lived and loved, and she died with a voice that cut through the world. You sound like her. Not in the words you use, but in the shape of them, antiquity nested inside modern accents. You carry a cadence I thought vanished with her." A tremor passed through Eloise. She imagined small, stubborn memories, her mother's hands shaping bread, a lullaby without a language that now arranged themselves into a pattern. The castle's pulse thrummed in agreement, as if something old within the stone recognized its kin. "Why is that important?" she asked. "What does it change for me?" "It changes everything," Valerian replied. "The old curse clings to my people like ivy. Where once we fed as men feed, we now hunger in a way that poisons our souls. Clara's death, her final word, bound us. Her voice made our need an unquenchable thirst. If her voice could bind, then perhaps another voice can unbind. You are not merely a curiosity, Eloise. You could be a key." He watched her carefully, gauging, measuring. Eloise wanted to scoff, to fling the words back in his face, and tell him his kind should learn to keep to their shadows. Yet in the hollow of her ribs something answered, a small bell ringing once with a clarity she could not ignore. She had said, not hours ago, phrases in French she had no memory of learning. She had seen her reflection blink out of time. She had felt the coin hum against her skin like an insect craving light. Each sensation was a piece of a map whose lines had only now begun to join. Valerian outlined what he needed from her with the economy of a man who had bartered many lives. A summit approached, an assemblage of human lords and vampire courts, a precarious negotiation dressed up as peace. There were those among his advisors who argued for binding pacts, treaties that would guarantee his people's survival by taking from the living. Others urged restraint, fearing a war that would unmake both races. The word Treaty of Dusk had leaked the length of 2 corridors already and set teeth on edge. The negotiations required a voice that could translate not just words, but the subtler music behind them. Nuance, threat, the awkward border between flattery and demand. He wanted Eloise to be that voice, his interpreter, his mediator to tongues that had not been heard aloud in generations. "In exchange," he said, and there was no theatrical flourish, only the bluntness of bargaining, "I will pay your $10,000, enough to buy you a life if you wish one." His eyes searched her face. "But there is a condition. You will not lie to me, in any language, not by omission, not by turning the shape of words. You will speak truth when I demand it." A bargain offered like this might have humbled another. Eloise felt the promise of gold like heat, but also the shadow of a chain. "Never lie," she parried. "Not even to protect someone." Valerian's mouth tugged in an almost smile. "Isn't protection often a fancy word for cowardice?" he asked. "Or for mercy? The question is yours. If you value your life and whatever poor dignity comes with it, you will decide whether you can live under that rule. Truth is a blunt instrument. It frees and it wounds." Defiance flared in her, a stubborn flame she'd tended through years of low wages and long hours. "I have lied to survive," she said. "I have been dishonest because the world teaches you to be, but I'm not a criminal. I owe you nothing." "I do not ask for loyalty," Valerian said quietly. "Only honesty. You may leave after the summit. You may take the coin and never set foot in the spire again. But understand this. If your voice can end what has been, then many will seek to use it. Some will look to free themselves, others to shackle what remains of humanity. You will be hunted by those who fear what you can do and courted by those who hope to profit." The clause was simple, sharp as a blade hidden under velvet. Eloise felt something widen inside her chest, part fear, part a dangerous curiosity. The castle was a living test, and perhaps she had already been measured and found wanting or worthy. The difference no longer mattered. She would not allow herself to be a blank to be written upon. If she was to be used, she would use in return. "All right," she said at last, and the sound of the single syllable seemed to echo along the stone. "I will do it, on one condition of my own." Valerian inclined his head. "Name it." "You do not call me little one or mademoiselle while we negotiate," she said, answering his earlier tone with a balance of jest and steel. "Use my name and use it like it matters." He looked at her, really looked, and there was the faintest tremor of something like amusement. "Eloise," he repeated, tasting the name. "Very well, Eloise, I will say it as if I mean it." The banquet was a cathedral unto itself. The great hall of the spire seemed to have been carved to hold the kind of echoes that feed immortality. Long tables where silverware gleamed with a light that was not quite natural, goblets that reflected back faces slightly altered by hunger. Masks of ivory and bone hid expressions, and those who wore them knew how to make their silence speak. The vampires at the feast were at once elegant and monstrous. Their movements were choreographed cruelty, every gesture honed by practice into a performance that made monsters look civilized. Eloise found herself led through a waltz of introductions she could hardly parse. Marquises with teeth like split pearls, viscounts with collars embroidered in human hair, emissaries from distant courts who spoke in cliques and smoke. The conversation around the table moved like a living thing, shifting between overture and threat. A faction favored the Treaty of Dusk, arguing that binding human territories under vampire stewardship would stop feeding raids and bring a controlled peace. Another faction, small but fierce, warned that treaties would breed contempt and rebellion, creating demands that would rot like unwatered roots. Eloise listened, translating phrases into shapes she could pass along, noting the small signs beneath words. A tightening of a jaw here, a disinterest of the eyes there. She realized quickly that she was not merely converting verbs, she was a spy for the cadence of power. Between courses, she caught snatches of a conversation she did not mean to hear. Two elder nobles spoke in a low, urgent whisper, their words softened with wine. "The last of the silver lineage," one said, tapping a finger on his goblet. "If she is as they claim, then the curse could be lifted," the other finished. "Imagine the shift. We would not have to hunt in the open. We could walk in daylight, own more, rule with less pretense." They spoke as if of weather, but Eloise felt the ice crawling down her spine. Her name, her blood, had become a ledger entry in the accounts of beings who measured lives in advantage and loss. She wanted to laugh or to run or to throw the goblet in their faces and watch their perfect masks crack. Instead, she kept counting phrases, practiced in the art of listening. It was during this evening that a familiar voice slipped into the knot of her attention like a fish into a net, Marius Fenn. He had always had a way of arriving where truths were most in need. He had the awkward gait of a man more comfortable with books than people, and his eyes, behind round spectacles, had the hunted look of someone who read between lines and found entire conspiracies. "Eloise," he said, sliding into the seat beside her with a clatter that made one of the viscounts look up with irritation. "You shouldn't be here. And yet you are," she whispered back. "Marius, what are you doing in a place like this?" He leaned close until the tips of their epaulets almost touched. "I came to warn you, don't be naive. There are those who would use you to end the curse. Others who would use you to alter us into something worse. You are a pawn, Eloise, but also, if you allow it, the fulcrum." She felt the words settle into her like a stone. "Tell me how, then. Tell me what the prophecy says." Marius's hand slipped into his pocket and produced a scrap of parchment so worn it might have been a fragment of a map. On it were words in a hand older than the treaty books. He traced them with a finger. "The voice that speaks for the dead," he whispered. "A line that says, 'When speech and blood converge, the night shall either end or endure.' Whoever can give voice to the dead, whoever can speak and be the echo of that final vow, can break the bind." Eloise saw then how easily rumor and desire braided. To some, she was a savior, to others, a tool. Either fate terrified her. She wanted to be more than the sum of their assumptions, to choose what tool she might be. But the banquet, with its liquid mirrors and whispered calculations, tightened around her like a corset. Even Valerian, who sat at the head of the table like a god who preferred discretion, was under the scrutiny of his own kind. His glances toward her a mixture of ownership and something that might, if she were generous, be mistaken for concern. During a lull, when a minstrel had been allowed to play an old lullaby on a brittle violin, Eloise excused herself to the halls. The castle's corridors were quieter here. She could hear the faint drip of water that sounded like counting. Passing an alcove, she discovered a mirror hung like an accusation. It was an old thing, framed in silver etched with stars and sorrow. The glass did not show the hall, but rather a room whose walls she recognized, the cramped attic where she had slept as a child, though rendered with an impossible clarity. Then, without warning, the surface swam and a voice threaded through the pane. "Child," it said, and it was her mother's voice, warm, cracked with years, speaking a tongue Eloise had not heard since dreams took it from her. "You have come far." She pressed her palm against the cold glass. It felt like a shiver. The mirror shifted images, brief glimpses of a woman with silver-streaked hair standing surrounded by banners, the crown of a queen resting crooked upon her brow. Those images came like lightning, one flash, then gone. The voice in the glass began to tell of a queen who had loved people too fiercely to let them be ensnared. Clara d'Argent, who defied not only kings but gods and who, in her dying breath, wove a word that saved and damned in equal measure. Eloise felt something she buried for years rise, pride, then shame, then a hollow longing. If these were indeed echoes of a lineage, if some woman with Clara's name had stood where she stood now, then her life was not merely a string of accidents but a thread pulled from the same cloth. She had always been taught to hide in the smallness of poverty, to keep her head down and her hands busy. The mirror forced her to look up. Before she could pull herself from the glass, Valerian appeared in the doorway. He paused, watching the reflected image. When he turned to look at his own reflection, there was nothing there. The glass showed everything but him. Yet for a heartbeat she felt, in the cure of the image, a warmth touched the shadow behind her, a shadow that reached and threaded itself with another. It was intimate and utterly wrong. "You should not stand too long before such things," Valerian said softly. "They show more than memory, they show permission." Eloise met his gaze and felt the gravity of the moment. He stood near enough that she could have read the small, private pains in the lines at the edge of his eyes. "Why can't you be in the glass?" He smiled, a sad curve that did not reach those places where humor lives. "Perhaps I am the sort of truth that a mirror fears, or perhaps I have been broken into 1,000 reflections and none fits." Her shadow touched his, and his hand trembled a fraction, not a hand offered for comfort, but one reaching for absolution. They moved then into that dangerous territory where pity and affection exchange garments. Attraction braided with dread, intimacy threaded by the knowledge of what he was and what she carried. She wanted to run her fingers through his hair and also strike him for every life taken in the name of survival. She wanted to forgive him for reasons she did not yet understand, and she wanted to hurl his crown into the deepest sea. The castle no more forgave fantasies than it forgave treasons. Its passages were monitors, and by the time the bells chimed midnight, the night was louder than before. Word came that an intruder had been sighted near the eastern parapet, a silhouette moving like a man with purpose. Night wardens scattered like knives, and Valerian's jaw set into a line that meant war was near. When the assassin appeared, he was as ordinary as a shadow and as precise as a well-honed blade. He wore no emblem, carried no ostentation. He was a point of focus, a man trained to end a life with one motion. He slipped through servants and masks with the skill of someone who had swallowed secrecy and made meal of it. His target was clear. Valerian's measured composure erupted into the cold fire of a sovereign threatened. Guards moved to intercept, but the man was faster than the net. Eloise watched as blades flashed and a struggle unfolded across the polished stone. The assassin's blade aimed true, seeking the space behind Valerian's ribs. The world narrowed into the clean geometry of intent. For a moment the air seemed to pause, expectant, like a held breath. Then something in Eloise rose, something not learned but remembered. Her mouth opened, and the sound that came was not the clumsy English of the market, nor the taut French of the café. It was a shape of tone and order that felt older than the castle's stones. "Erert," she said, but the word that left her lips was not merely a command in French. It carried the resonance of the dead, an imperative that did not ask and therefore could not be refused. The assassin's arms stilled as though strings had been looped around his bones. The blade quivered and then slipped from his fingers like a leaf from a branch in autumn. He sank to his knees, eyes wide and empty, as if drained of purpose. Valerian's face moved through a dozen small expressions: astonishment, something like gratitude, then calculation. He had been trained to mistrust miracles and to fear them when they came free. Eloise felt naked under his attention, but something steadied her. The certainty that when her voice rose it did not merely speak. It held the power to reform the will of those who heard it. When the echoes of the skirmish died, Valerian was closer than before. His fingers skimmed the fabric of her sleeve, not a touch meant to own but to study. "You saved my life," he said in a voice that was equal parts accusation and confession. "You could have allowed the general to die and taken the consequence of reshaping us." Her pulse hammered against her teeth. "He was about to murder someone," she said. "Even if your kind does not value certain lives, I do. I will not be used to facilitate cruelty." Valerian's gaze softened, and there in it she saw not only the ruler but a man burdened by choices made long ago. "You can free us," he said, "or you can end us. I do not know which scares me more." The admission was at once an appeal and a warning. A ruler should never be vulnerable in front of his servants, yet vulnerability unspooled between them like a ribbon. He had seen her power, and in it had seen salvation. He had also seen the blade it represented. Trust was no longer something he could afford to dispense lightly. Later, they found themselves upon the roof under a moon that watched like a slow, deliberate eye. The city lay below them, a clotted map of roofs and fog and stubborn lamps like stars smothered by cloud. Here, Above the orchestration of the spire, they could speak without masks and without servants listening for the catch of a breath to translate into rumor. Valerian told her the story as if each word were a blade he was daring to lay down. Of a queen who had defied the gods and how, when she died, her final voice had bound his people to a hunger that balanced upon cruelty like a weather vane. He spoke of treaties turned teeth, of villages emptied, of promises made and broken. "I betrayed her," he confessed finally, and the words fell into the night like a confession torn from the throat. "I was young then, enamored by power. I thought to buy peace with compromise. I did not see the heart in what I was doing until it was much too late." Eloise listened, and in the listening she found the raw edge of human things. Regret, meant not to erase but to explain. "Is forgiveness what frees you?" she asked, the question a leaf tossed into a river. He looked at her with an intimacy that frightened her more than any blade. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps death is the only absolution insane enough to right centuries of error. I cannot know, but I know this. You stand at the fulcrum. Whether you choose to speak absolution or to pull the lever that ends me, the world will change." She laid a hand on the cold stone, feeling the thin hum of the spire rise into her blood. The choice felt enormous in that instant, absurd and heavy, like deciding the fate of a city with the weight of a single word. To forgive would be to offer a life. To refuse might be to usher in an age of a different kind of tyranny. Their faces were close enough to see the moonlight paint the small imperfections in skin and bone. For a moment, the savagery and the tenderness of the night braided together and became something almost holy. Valerian reached up as if to touch her cheek, and she did not turn away. The brush of his fingers was an electric thing, an apology, a request, a remembrance. "I am not sure I can forgive you," she admitted, voice small as a confession. "But I am sure I will know when the time comes." He smiled, bitter and beautiful. "Then promise me you will use your voice with eyes open." His hand lingered on the place where her collarbone showed. "Promise me that, Eloise." She met his gaze, and in the space between moon and stone found a strand of something like trust. She did not make promises she could not keep, but she said the only thing that felt true. "I will not lie to you, Valerian. I will speak truth. That is all I can offer." He nodded, a man relieved and alarmed to be given such clean terms. The night wind lifted, and for a second the world seemed to wait for a word, for a choice, for a sound that would become destiny. The summit opened like a wound laid bare. The great hall had been drained of its usual velvet secrecy and filled instead with human lords in their stiff collars, ambassadors with the pale, practiced courtesy of men used to bargaining lives as if they were cargo, and the vampire delegates, masks less ornate than before, their teeth restrained beneath polite smiles that glittered with threat. The chandeliers shed their slow bloodlight, and for the first time in years, the spire felt as if it might split into two different kinds of night. One where treaties could be signed, and another where old and hungry rules reasserted themselves with a whisper and a bite. Eloise stood between them all like a conduit with no plug. Her notes, her translations, the chords of her voice that had been trained to carry nuance and to catch the swells of unspoken meaning. The room smelled of wax, of old paper, of leather-laid threat. For a while the summit managed a brittle civility. Phrases translated, questions reframed into gentler shapes, drinks passed, records kept. Valerian presided with the discomfort of a man who knew both the art of diplomacy and the cost of each concession. He listened, he watched, he kept his fingers folded like iron. But diplomacy is only the clothing of deeper hunger. The faction that favored the Treaty of Dusk, men and women who imagined a world of tidy feeding schedules and legal ownership of peasantry, grew louder in their petition. They spoke of security like a commodity, of peace that could be purchased by contract. A human ticked through the clauses and measured them against ledgers. A vampiric noble smiled and saw only property, boundaries written into law instead of blood. Each side flinched at the other's demands, and under the polite syllables, a more dangerous conversation unspooled. Marius Fenn had not come to praise the treaty. He had arrived to pry off its thin varnish. He moved through the assembly with the awkward, determined gait of a scholar who has learned to wear brashness like armor. He had always been a curator of inconvenient facts, a man who read the margins and found truths others wanted kept in the dark. Eloise had thought of him as an ally, quiet, loyal, problematic in his disregard for how fragile some plans were. But alliances become expedient things in a room full of knives. When Marius stood and produced the scrap of parchment that had once been a map in his hands, his voice did not tremble. He unfolded the line of the prophecy and translated it in the bluntness of someone who wanted light more than tact. "This assembly," he said, letting the words fall like stones into a still pool, "houses a woman among you who is the last known heir of Clara d'Argent. She is called the Silver Voice. She will speak for the dead, and in speaking will either end the hunger or set it into new chains." The hall did not wait for the consequences of Marius's revelation. Some faces paled. Others, accustomed to taking advantage, sharpened with appetite. The night wardens stiffened as if the air itself had become a blade. There are dignities that die hard, and there are sovereignties that erupt when the possibility of change arises. Valerian's jaw tightened into a shape that meant calculation and terror braided together. To the human delegations, this was a power to be either extorted or weaponized. To the hardline vampires within Valerian's council, it was a threat to the established order. The idea that a single mortal, no, a woman of uncertain lineage, could undo centuries of practiced survival was intolerable. The room split on an axis that had always existed beneath its surface. Those desperate for change and those desperate to maintain the comfortable cruelty that fed them. Whispers became shouts. One of Valerian's generals, tall, heavy-limbed, a bear of a man known as Roth whose loyalty had been bought and sharpened with victories, rose and accused Marius of treason. "You bring sedition to the spire," Roth roared, his voice a thing like a stump breaking. He called for Eloise's imprisonment until the council could decide what to do with such a volatile relic. The night wardens moved as if on a wire pulled by Roth's fury, their blades glinting in the shadow and their veiled faces closing around Eloise like closing hands. Panic pressed at the room's perimeters. Human envoys, no less frightened than the vampires eager to keep their meat schedules intact, demanded guarantees. The treaty text, once a dry series of paragraphs, became a live instrument of suspicion. Someone whispered that, if the Silver Voice were bound to a court, it could be used to force the living into chains. In whose hands would such a weapon not become lethal? The idea of using a single person as a key to rewrite a centuries-old plague turned stomachs and hardened hearts alike. Valerian's own people looked to him and saw indecision as weakness. The night wardens, his wardens, his guardians, began to murmur of taking action without his sign, of sealing Eloise away and proceeding with the treaty through more clandestine, mercenary means. To stand and watch such an unraveling would make him a stamp of cowardice, and to choose Eloise over his court could mean civil war within the spire. In that moment, the king faced his oldest duel, the man he had become because of his choices, and the man he might be freed to become. He stood amid the storm of fears and had to decide which life he would protect, the worn legacy of his people, or the fragile, mortal woman who might finally loosen the binding that had damned both their kinds. He chose poorly for a while, the way men do when pressure makes decisions shallow. Valerian stood and bade calm, his voice even but brittle, and promised a council to decide Eloise's fate. That wish had no leverage over the beast of urgency. Roth and the night wardens moved then, their oaths binding their hands to an action before the king could carve out a different future. Someone in the human delegation, terrified of what would happen if the vampires seized her power without scrutiny, made a show of backing a treaty clause that called for Eloise's sequestration. In the flash of that agreement, the hall erupted. Swords were out, faces came unmasked. Where there had been civility lay now the bare hunger for preemptive advantage. Eloise did not wait to be caged. The moment blades were drawn, seconds extended like hours, and she felt the gravity of the choice she'd been given by life and call. She might be a pawn, she might be a fulcrum. The difference lay in whether she allowed herself to be used. She thought of Clara d'Argent's final word, of how a voice could chain or free. And she thought of the coin that had burned through her apron, dragging her by flame to this very place. She found her voice without premeditation, and when she spoke the sound was not merely a translation or a clerkly conversion. It was an instrument that reshaped will. The first syllable was like iron and silk braided together, a note that took hold of the smallest threads of intent in the bodies around her. "Ty's toy," she said to the room in a sound that was both command and music. The Night Warden's knives trembled, and a human envoy's breath snagged. It was as if someone had plucked the underlying music of volition and tuned it to hush. The power that had once stopped an assassin now unfurled more broadly. She learned, with a raw, animal quickness, that her voice could not only impede but redirect. It could make the faithful hesitate and the treacherous recalibrate. For a moment she felt omnipotent, the axis around which an age might be shifted. But the thing that came with such power was always extraction. Each use braided a thread from her life into the fabric of the command. Her lips tingled, her throat dried, her vision shimmered at the corners. The room, once a vessel of clamor, fell into a hush that vibrated like a held chord. It was not enough. Roth had already moved, his hand a blur. He lunged with the intent of crushing both sovereign and supplicant into a single sacrifice to the old order. Valerian intercepted with the savagery of a man whose reign required violence. The general's blade found purchase in the air where Valerian had been a fraction too slow. The strike meant for the woman became a strike for the king instead. Valerian's coat took the steel. He staggered but did not fall. The wound bloomed beneath silk, a red bright as the chandeliers. Roth's face contorted, not with fear but with the certain nobility of a man who believed in the righteousness of his action. He had thought to secure the future of their rule by removing the variable. Instead, he had ignited a war within the heart of the spire. Valerian's eyes flared with an old kind of fury. The restraint that had been his armor snapped. He moved like a predator made holy by hurt. With emotion honed by centuries of trained cruelty and leadership, he seized Roth, twisting the general's weight as if he had been a rag, and sent him to the floor. The room watched as Valerian, stumbling but unbowed, displayed for all the messy truth of his nature. He could be both savior and executioner. He dispatched the mutinous general with a gesture too swift and clean for any of the assembly to fully comprehend. Roth was silenced before his treachery could birth a larger massacre. The other would-be conspirators, shocked by the violence and by the king's ferocity, faltered. Valerian gathered Eloise as the last calculated risks ebbed. He pressed her to him with a fierceness that was somehow both protective and possessive, the king's hands stained with the blood of his own. She felt the heat of his wounds against her ribs, and the dull throb of her own bleeding life with every breath she borrowed to sing the world into order. "Do you see now?" he asked between clenched teeth, voice near a whisper. "Do you see what has waited for your choice?" She could see the terror that lined the edge of his rule, not the swagger of sovereign, but the brittle shell of a man terrified of being unmade. Around them, the hall teetered between law and mutiny, its order held by nothing more than the choice of a few men, and the voice of a woman who had not yet understood the full cost of her power. Eloise understood then that to wield the voice of blood was to spend currency that could not be replenished. The first time she'd used it, she had felt the exhilaration of rescue. Now, as her throat calmed and her pulse slowed like an exhausted bell, she felt the ledger balancing in another way, one of debts that demanded payment in flesh. The lightness in her limbs became leaden. She tasted iron on her tongue and understood that every command had called a small piece of her away. She had to decide, and she had to act in the sweep of a single breath. The treaty could not be allowed to become a legal masterwork for cruelty. The sequestration of her would have been the first step. Ownership of speech was tyranny. The murmurs of the assembly had already turned to numbers, and those numbers were hungry. There, between a wounded sovereign and a hall that smelled of old bargains torn open, she chose. She stepped forward, placing her hands flat upon the stone as if bracing herself against the world. Her voice, when it rose, was not merely the cadence of a translator, but the final cry of an old lineage calling its debts. She spoke in French, a phrase too simple and too laden to be anything but an instrument of mercy. "GT pardon," she said, and the words found Valerian's ear like rain finding a thirsty field. The castle seemed to inhale. The syllables hung, vibrating on the cold air. The binding that had tightened around centuries like a noose uncoiled with the impossible slowness of falling things. Where silence had been a hunger, forgiveness became a door. The vampires who had listened felt their stomachs unclench as if some terrible thirst had been soothed. The night wardens staggered, their old compulsion ebbing like tide. For a breath, precious, tremulous, the long curse that had fed on blood and dominion gave way to something unanticipated. But the breaking of a curse is not a tidy absolution. It is a tearing and a remaking, and its toll was immediate and cruel. Valerian's wound seared with an unanticipated agony as sunlight, or a thing like it, or the moral light held by a world that had been kept at bay for ages, flooded the spire in a way it had not done in centuries. He clutched at Eloise as if to hold both her and himself steady, while the change did its work. Blood welled in places that had not known harm because immortality had been dull and preserved. He hissed, a sound like a man tasting salt on a wound. Eloise felt her own strength fray as the voice that had spoken the saving word emptied her of more than blood. It emptied her of a warmth she had carried as steady as a hearth. As dawn spilled, impossible and unbelievable in its gentleness, through the stained glass windows of the spire, Valerian's skin began to take on a different quality. He had lived so long in the shelter of night that light was an alien element. Now it struck him like accusation. It laced across his shoulders in filigree and seared in patterns where old guilt met new grace. He coughed, and the sound was more human than Eloise had ever heard it. The king, who had commanded the fate of millions and had been made of the night, began to burn. She could have denied him absolution. She could have let him burn and end the breed he had led. The world might have twisted to a more merciful future or tipped into another form of ruin. There is no simple justice in acts of this scale. Eloise had been given a responsibility she had not asked for, and to use it meant to exchange her future for the promise of a different world. She wrapped her arms around him as sunlight washed the hall and the little deaths it coaxed. Valerian shuddered in her hold, eyes half-lidded and so not entirely there. "Would you serve me again in another life?" he asked, his voice a brittle thing that still held the man's old timbre, wounded, intimate, contrite. The question was not for the throne or for the treaty, but for something that had grown in the interstices, an affection that had been coaxed from fierce need and shared confessions. Eloise felt the ledger of lives and debts in the bones of her palms and answered as the world tilted. "Taugers," she said, and the French was an anchor she had always kept on a string around her throat. Always, in every tongue, if the world still let love be the north. His hand found hers and held it with the surprising gentleness of a man letting go. Light caught him, and for a moment he was only the man she had seen in the cafe, then the sovereign, then something beyond both. He exhaled, a sound like a door finally closing on itself, and where breath had been there was ash like fine dust slipping from his coat. Eloise felt the grains sift through her fingers as he crumbled into the fate of what he had been. King, sinner, lover. There was no thunderous vanishing, no cinematic fire. There was only the quiet collapse of the burden he had carried and the leaving of a hollow that would be filled in time by different, less violent things. She did not feel triumphant. She felt bereaved. The spire, which had known its ruler for centuries, seemed to shrink without his presence. In that contraction, the city outside, Grievehaven, felt the first morning it had not tasted hunger. The sunlight found gutters and windows, and the faces of people who had not expected to see a dawn that did not taste like exile. Months afterward, the city's skin had changed. Where fog had clung like shawls, light now threaded through the alleys. Traders set up stalls that had once been abandoned to night. Laughter, scarce and rusty, returned like a long-mendied instrument. Eloise had kept the gold Valerian had offered, enough to rebuild an existence. But she had also kept the ash in a velvet-lined box, a small private relic for a man who had been more than cruelty and less than holy cruelness. She had named her café Clara's voice in a quiet ceremony that no one witnessed. It was not a celebration so much as a choice to remember that someone like Clara had existed, and that speech could be used to save as well as to wound. Clara's voice opened at dawn, and for the first time in a very long while, Grievehaven's mornings tasted like coffee and warm bread instead of the iron tang that had come with unquiet nights. Eloise painted the sign herself, and the letters had an uneven, deliberate slant to them. People came, workers, scholars, the odd noble who wanted to watch a city remake itself. The menu was simple, translated into several languages by hand, a humble offering to the world she had once fled and now helped to rebuild. On an ordinary evening, as the last cups were rinsed and the lamp on the counter burned low, the bell over the door chimed. Eloise looked up from folding a napkin and saw a figure in the doorway. For a beat, her heart stilled because shadows have memories and because men's faces repeat like motifs in a sad, Baroque song. The stranger moved with the quiet economy of someone who knew how to enter a room without disturbing its lesser harmonies. His coat was dark, but not as it had been, less like night itself and more like charcoal on a page. When he stepped forward, the light caught the angles of a face she would have sworn she knew in another book, another life. He smiled, not the cruel thing from the past, but a smile bearing the weary civility of someone who had remembered how to be small and alive. His eyes, those impossible eyes, held the echo of nights and a gentleness that had been rare enough to frighten her once. He sipped the air like a man savoring a place he had lost and found. Eloise did not ask. She did not demand explanation or proof. She moved as she had the whole time, with small, steady gestures. She set a cup in front of him and brushed a speck of flour from his sleeve, as if he had been a common friend returning from the market. The city hummed around them, a chorus of survival made gentler by light. He inclined his head, and the room seemed to breathe with her. "You named it well," he said softly, and there was an old echo in his voice like the memory of a melody. "Clara's voice." Eloise's chest tightened. She reached across the counter and laid her hand over his, feeling warmth that was living and real. The bell chimed again with the soft insistence of smaller, necessary things. She leaned close and whispered the words that had once ended a curse and begun a different kind of reckoning. "Welcome back, my king."